YouTube, Spotify, Google Cast, wherever you're listening to this here. Welcome back to another episode of Heart of the Cast. Episode dry, I think, yes?
Yes, 3.
Episode...
And I'm now under the toad for anyone who's watching it instead of just listening.
Yeah, you see, it's on my stream today, so we've actually managed to fix it up in a correct fashion in a way. So, yeah, the aesthetics here are improving. I don't have too much to show on screen. I didn't have a lot of preparation time as much as I would like to this time, but don't worry. This is quite a open-ended, evergreen kind of topic we're discussing today. What are we talking about today, Mr. Schmidt?
Today is the combo deck episode, where we discuss the entire topic and the history of what combo decks are in Yu-Gi-Oh!, what they represent, how we like them, what we like about them, what we don't like about them, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so combo is probably the most controversial playstyle in any game for the trading card games in general. Like a lot of people in Pokemon, Magic, Hearthstone, they've always generally been quite critical of, you know, these long turns that sometimes end in ways that don't allow you to play, etc., etc. So today we're going to be going through all of the kind of iterations of the styles of combo decks we've seen throughout the history of this game, and then we'll be talking a little bit about, you know, conceptually, do we think that this is good, this is not good, etc., and things like that. Talk a little bit about the evolution of combo, going from deck lists to deck lists. Nothing specific, but there are obviously very, very certain examples that come up in the mind when we talk about combo. We're going to have a separate subsection dedicated to Pendulum, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, Pendulum is a bit of a unique thing here, and we figured that we would give it its own little dedicated subsection because it is generally been a combo deck, and insofar as that Konami even changed the rules of the games to address Pendulum, if you think about it. So we've been talking about the types of disruption that exist in the game: negates, floodgates, multiple miscellaneous disruptions, Book of Moon, stuff like that combo decks can end on, Hieratic Seals, bouncing, stuff like that. The counters to combo, the necessary evil of floodgates or Maxi, and then we talked about the future. So you want to kick us off with portion number 1?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the main things that I'm thinking of when I'm thinking combo decks is that I think there's a big difference between what combo decks are in Yu-Gi-Oh! And what combo decks like typically are. And I feel like we can talk a little bit about why that is, because when I'm sure if you ask anyone in the Magic sphere or anything like that, you would hear an answer of like, well, a combo deck is something that takes a while to assemble its combo pieces, and once it gets the combo pieces together, it's gonna pop off basically, right? There'll very often be decks that end up on some sort of loop, whatever, if once they establish certain combinations of cards, right? And I feel like that's the main thing that combo decks do in other games that they don't really do in Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is take a lot of time, right? Because that's usually the downside in other games, is like, well, your glaring weakness is you're going to take some time to assemble all those pieces. So if you're playing against some other faster decks, right, then they're going to take you out, right? And that's how combo decks operate in other card games very often, which is not really the case in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because in Yu-Gi-Oh! I feel like the main definition that we have for combo decks is just anything that has a relatively long quote unquote combo on the first turn, right?
Exactly. First turn, I think, is like the key differentiation between Yu-Gi-Oh! And other games. You look at Hearthstone, for example, played a decent amount of that, and any combo deck that exists in Hearthstone, I mean, you can't do anything for the first couple of turns.
Exactly. Those were the kind of decks where, like, okay, I'm a combo deck, so I'm going to wait until I find my pieces, which is sometimes turn 9, 10, 11, whatever, right? And obviously, also partially because you need a specific amount of mana to do all those things, right? And this is something that we don't have in Yu-Gi-Oh!, which in general, often because Yu-Gi-Oh! Is so fundamentally different from a lot of these other resource-based card games, these sort of typical terms that we have for, like, you know, combo, mid-range, control, they don't always apply perfectly to Yu-Gi-Oh! It's hard to apply those concepts from other games to this game. So we've kind of, I feel like as the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community, we've developed our own kind of meaning behind the word combo deck, which is rather different from what they use in these other games.
Yeah, so for some context, we were writing out the script of sorts last night, talking about how we would subdivide this topic. And even between us, we were struggling to really try and come up with like a consistent framework explaining what does combo actually mean. Do
Yeah.
you measure combo in the number of steps and how long a combo takes, or do you
Yeah.
measure it in its end board? Because
Hmm.
there's a very big difference between, for example, Ritual Beast and Goki, right? But to
Yeah.
some extent, depending on the hand, Ritual Beast can have as many steps, right,
Yep.
in terms of like the duration of the turn.
Yep.
Salomon Great is another great example, I think. Salomon Great has a lot of steps in the combo.
Yep.
But I don't think anyone would ever call Salomon Great a combo deck, right?
I mean, I think it's fair to call it a combo deck. It's just that we have multiple terms with these because I also hear Salamangreat often being referred to as quote unquote a mid range deck. But at the same time, the term mid range is the same thing in Yu Gi Oh because mid-range decks classic the name is that because they aim to finish the games like somewhere in the middle, right? They're not super fast but they're also not super slow. That's why they're called mid-range. Whereas in Yu-Gi-Oh you would think of that as like, okay, how many turns does the deck usually take to win? Well, even for mid-range decks that can often be 1, 2, 3 turns, right? So like even in that sense the mid-range also doesn't really apply, right? And it's so it feels like well,
The thing
first of
with
all,
that
when we had this discussion
definition is
yesterday.
I feel like there's so many decks in Yu-Gi-Oh that even the non-combo decks, they all aim to end the game by turn 3, right? If you win the dice roll. Even like even something like Labyrinth, you could argue, right? You like put up enough disruption and you can just like OTK on turn 3 or
No,
at least
Labyrinth
have
is genuinely also something I would consider a combo deck, even though because
oh, okay.
it's not really a stun deck anymore, but like it's basically we have a lot of different flavors of combo, and that's what we settled on is that we have to distinguish between and go a little bit deeper into it. And at some point during the discussion yesterday, I just said, hey, we should just have that discussion on the podcast because I think that's one of the more interesting parts of the entire discussion of like what exactly is combo. And I actually don't even think it's that good of a term in Yu-Gi-Oh context because it's simply like I feel like theoretically way too many decks fall under the category and it doesn't even really, you don't really have a way to distinguish Manadium from Salamangreat, even though as a Yu-Gi-Oh player it feels like there should be a difference between how classify these two decks.
Yeah, I think like personally when I was like trying to think about it and we talked a little bit yesterday, I think one of like the major differing points here, it's really interesting you mentioned Labyrinth as potentially a combo deck, but
Hmm.
like you think of that, you would never put that in the same category as like Adamancipator, for example,
Yeah.
at its height, right?
Yeah.
And I think one
Hmm.
of like the main differentiating factors is generally what I've noticed is like the combo decks, like we're talking like the Yugi Boomer, I hate Yu-Gi-Oh type of combo decks, the people who
Hmm.
complain about those 30-minute turns, like generally there seems to be, from what I understand, like a trend of like a huge usage of the extra deck,
Hmm.
and also very little follow-up. Generally,
Okay.
that's applied quite well to lots of these big build-a-board generic extra deck heavy first turn decks, right? But at the same time,
Yeah.
that sometimes falls apart because if you look at something like Drytron never really used a lot of its extra deck. You were
Yeah.
really just relying on that Herald. And you could
It's
argue they
yeah.
had a lot of follow-up, even if you did manage to
Mhm.
crack the field.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, yeah. Like one other like one more Benton in hand, and you have like all the Drytrons in the graveyard, and you just go. But I yeah no the use of the extra deck and stuff like that, and I feel like that's more like a commonly occurring pattern rather than what defines it, because it's just like it just happens to be that a lot of the combo decks do that, and it also is true that a lot of the combo decks, not all of them, um, go kind of like all in. If you have an answer or if then I probably won't be winning the game. But the way I like to think about it, the way I distinguish like what I would call an all-in like sort of combo deck in Yu-Gi-Oh is I like to think of what they try to achieve with their first turn combo, right? Which is like in the sense of the all-in combo decks is like they try to make a board, or it doesn't even have to be a board. It can also be like by some hand loop of sorts, or even technically like an FTK, right? But it's something that like doesn't even give your opponent a chance to play, right? Like the kind of boards that, for example, Super Heavy Samurai used to make or does currently make in Master Duel are the kind of boards that you look at it, and if you haven't stopped it with a hand trap, you don't even try to play the game. As opposed to something like a Salamangreat end board, where even if you don't interrupt them at all, you let them play for however long it takes. Um, you will still draw your hand and try to play into it because you still probably have a chance because what they end on is not immediately game winning.
And see, I think like that's definitely one angle to take, but at the same time, because of the way go second cards work in Yu-Gi-Oh, and because of how powerful some of these blowouts are, you kind of can try and see if you can break it, right? I mean, just one example, I was at locals the other night, and I was playing against Manadium, and I lost the
Yep.
dice roll. And both
Mhm.
games, I won the game one, because I just set 5 into a combo deck. You know, like Apollosa doesn't do anything as to retro tribute, right? So it's like I think if you're defining it by, okay, well, we're going to give up and just move on to the next game, it's like, well, it depends on your deck, I think, right? And it depends on the cards you're playing because there are so many blowouts you can play in a game.
Yes. I'm not sure if I would use transaction rollback Burning Abyss as the best benchmark
But like
to
you could argue
essentially
like Labyrinth is very similar in that way, right? Like heavy trap versions of Labyrinth can definitely go second into combo
uh,
decks. They can
I
sometimes play
guess
golems.
I guess it falls under the category of I think what I said is true for about 90% of situations, right? It's like
Mm.
unless you have a very specific answer like a dark ruler or a sphere mode or whatever that are very specifically designed to crack combo boards, right? Any normal hand, right? Any normal hand of like maybe a couple engine cards and then maybe some it can have some non-engine, but nothing that's specifically designed to break the board. Like if it's not a dark ruler, but rather like I don't know, a Book of Moon or a Talents or whatever. Those are the kind of hands where if I draw 5 engine pieces and a Talents, I'm definitely going to be in the game against a Salamangreat player, a Dragonlink player, any sort of these strategies, right? Like I'm just going to play into it, and I have a good chance of winning. Whereas if I'm playing against Super Heavy Samurai and I draw 5 engine and a Talents, I don't even have to try. It's not worth it.
Do you really think so? I think like if you've got a good engine with talents, like that could potentially be kind of breakable. But I think this sort of ties in a little bit to something we're going to talk about later, which is like the types of disruptions. Because some
Hmm.
combo decks end on um, types of disruptions that it doesn't even matter. Like one example I'm thinking of is like Buster Lock, right? That was really popular in Dragon Link. They literally
Hmm.
ended on what? A Savage Negate and a Seals and the Buster Lock, which is like that's basically
Yeah.
3, but because you've been Buster Locked, it doesn't matter if you have like 20 cards in hand unless one of them
Yeah.
specifically stops that
Hmm.
Buster Lock, then it doesn't really matter, right? Like so it's really weird because I think the type of disruption makes a big difference as to whether or not you attempt to play.
There's definitely a difference even within the category of like the hardcore combo decks. There's definitely a difference between something that can potentially be outed if you have the right cards, and then there's even some that even if you have a card like Dark Ruler or Sphere Mode, like it doesn't even matter because like think back when Scythe Lock was allowed, or we had Gumblar looping 4 cards out of your hand before you even went to your first main phase, right? And so there's definitely still even within the category of what I personally find rather unhealthy decks. There's even fine differences there. Yeah.
It's strange because I feel like in Yu-Gi-Oh, it's quite easy to define like a stun deck.
Mhm.
Pretty straightforward to define control.
Yep.
Um, Less so with mid-range, but combo, yeah, there's just a lot of layers to
Yep.
what it actually means to be a combo deck, you know?
I
Um,
think mainly I think we all technically understand what a combo deck is. I think the main distinguish the main difference we need to point out is that there are combo decks that are I think the term that people most often use is like fair and unfair or healthy and unhealthy combo decks, right? Like
yeah.
and I feel like the fine line between the two, the only one that I can think of is the one that I said earlier where I feel like the healthy combo decks they combo for a while, but they still aim to play a real game after, right? Like if your opponent plays into it, you're going to develop an actual back and forth gameplay. Whereas like there's other combo decks, if they pull through the full combo, it's basically just a question of does your opponent have a hard counter in their hand? Yes, they can win. No, they don't even have a chance. Like you don't even have to really like you feel bad for your opponent for even trying sometimes, right? Because you're just like there's no way.
Yeah, I think like maybe probably a good way to look at it is the defining factor can just be like how easy it is for pure engine to go into a board, right? I think
Yeah.
like if you have nothing but engine cards going into like a
Yep.
super heavy field, I
Hmm.
don't really see you winning that in most cases. I don't really know what engine can even beat that except like decks that just have inherently built in
I mean,
like
super heavy ends on
removals.
like if it depends on the version, but super heavy, even if it doesn't go for a side lock or whatever, or a hand loop, they can just end on like three Omni Negates plus Appaloosa. It's like you're not going to.
Yeah, exactly. Um, so where do we define something like mid-range? That seems to be the kind of because it's. I found it very strange that you would argue that potentially Labyrinth could be considered a combo deck, which
I think the two go hand in hand. I think I what whether you call it a fair combo deck because it doesn't aim to auto win immediately, which that includes the possibility to go longer than just turn one, right? If your board is not broken enough to immediately win the game and have your opponent scoop, then your deck has to be quote unquote mid range, right? Because you're gonna have to plan for going to more turns and maybe lose your board and have to rebuild later, which is an ability that some combo decks just don't have because they, like you said, empty their extra deck very early on, or like have certain resources that they only play once and it's gone. But like the what we call mid range is, I think, the same as what we would define fair combo as, because it's the kind of decks that don't aim to win with their board immediately most of the time, and therefore they have to have some sort of plan for follow up, you know, those kind of things, right?
yeah, which I think ties us nicely into talking about the combo uh, style of Yu-Gi-Oh as a conceptual sort of idea. Do we think that this is a good idea? For example, I think
Hmm.
unanimously for probably the majority of players that you would ask. Is combo healthy? Is I think probably going to be a no for anyone who is looking at combo in the category of, for example, Dart World, Adamancipator, Goki, Drytron. I think a lot of players would look at something like this and think like this is a very good example of not okay combo decks.
You
Um,
know, for the simplicity of this podcast, so we don't have to go redefining it every time or specify what we mean, let's just classify that as combo, and let's classify the other stuff as mid-range for now, because in my head that makes sense to
mhm.
just talk of Salamangreat as a mid-range deck, for example. And then, of course, there's some decks that will be like on the verge of between mid range and combo or whatever. But I guess that would make Labyrinth, for example, in that example, it would also be a mid range deck, right? But I think anything that is considered a combo deck in that sense, I personally don't find it healthy. And my main issue with it, and I also think that's the main difference between combo and mid range, is that it's usually only fun for one player. And of course, the entire question of what is fun in Yu-Gi-Oh is very it's very subjective. But I think the main takeaway is that whether like when a combo deck is involved, very often it's only fun for one player, because I do understand the people that like to play combo decks themselves, right? Like I can understand how it's cool to figure out the different ways on how to do your turn one plays, play around hand traps, maneuver around certain, like maybe develop certain lines that cover for your opponent, having certain board breakers, figure out the lines through nib, through whatever, right? That sort of thing, I find it fun
Yeah, very
myself as
appealing.
well. I can see it. But what you also have to understand is that for your opponent, usually it's not going to be very fun. And the same is true the other way as well. Like it's not only always fun for the combo player. Like sometimes, like it's also not fun to play the super all-in combo decks in Master Duel and get max seed, or get drolled and just pass your turn and get run over by even a mid-range deck, because even a mid-range deck these days, if they stop you for one turn and you basically have no defensive or almost no defensive cards in your deck, they're going to run you over as well, and it's not fun either, right? And so I feel like it's very rare for combo decks to provide like a fun gameplay experience for both sides.
Did you ever experience the Zoomer nonsense that the high level players could be doing at events where people would literally just declare like I will just skip this part, right? Where it's like you just put the two rapiers in your graveyard and then you summon like whatever like the end board was, right? Like there was a period in time where people were like just gentlemen's agreeing, very illegal probably today anyway, to just like skip the linear portion because everyone knew it.
Mhm.
And so you just put the field up, right? Like I think I want to say Zodiac was like an era of that, right?
I don't remember that specific thing, but I could
I could
imagine
just be
that.
yapping, but I feel like if anyone does recall that, let me know. But I do vaguely remember people just agreeing to like skip certain portions.
It's the kind of thing that I do when I test with friends. Just let me skip this part
Yeah.
because we both know how it works, but I don't
Well, the
remember
the
people
reason I
doing it
bring
in
that up
tournaments.
is where I was going with that was I think like that seems really boring and unfun, right? But I think one of the more exciting combo decks is the non-linear combo decks, right? Which is
Mhm.
why I'm gonna be the bad guy, I guess. But I really enjoyed Emancipator. I really really like that
Oh
deck.
no,
You
I'm
know.
not ready for the block dragon talk yet. We're not ready for that discussion.
And if we wanna keep it somewhat neutral, that's why a lot of people loved Full Power Tier Limit. Was that it was a combo deck? I think we'd call it a combo deck. That was very non-linear. You
I mean,
had like
the first one that I thought of was the Danger FTK. Because let me
that
tell
is a
you,
good one as well. Yeah, that's a
that
perfect
deck
example.
was so fun to play. But at the same
But it's an
time,
FTK.
it circles back to what I said earlier. None of my opponents at the two YCSs I taught with that deck, none of them had fun. They did not have fun. That's the thing, right? I had fun, and I get it. I also understand why you enjoy playing at Emancipator. But I've been on the receiving end of an Emancipator first turn after my Max C got called by the Graved in Master Duel. And I do not care how fun this is for my opponent right now. Like, I
Like
do not care about how, I don't know how much like dopamine you're getting from that reveal off of that researcher. I
you
don't
just
care. I'm
never
not
know what's
getting
in
any
the
of it.
box, dude.
I'm not getting any of that dopamine. It's all yours. So
You might get some W if it's like 5 spells. That might make you happy.
I guess, yeah, but it's always 4 spells, and then the rock is the fifth one. So
Yeah, someone mentioned like Block Dragon was it like we all know that Quackimera Guardian was the real problem of that deck.
oh god, dude, keep this out of our group project. You can yap that on your private.
On your own personal stream, yeah.
Yeah,
Um, and it's really weird because like the combo decks like at Emancipator felt like if you had like the right hand traps, it was very beatable because of certain choke points like on Halka Fibrax, for example, were kind of good and
hmm
things like that. But there's like some particularly degenerate options, which it's not something that was super popular, but low key, Dino with Misk was one of the most ignorant things I've ever experienced in this game. Was
yeah,
just being able to just make your card unaffected by all of your dinos, not even the
yeah.
ones you currently control, every single one of them. Like that is, I think, really frustrating to sit and watch as a player. Is
It's
your
that
opponent?
that is an extra. It's an extra layer of frustration because one initial problem of the combo decks, because they put so much weight on their first turn, right? Which by default, the first turn in Yu-Gi-Oh is the least interactive because you can only really like it just comes down to have I drawn hand traps or not, right? Other cards that I have to my disposal, I can't use them yet, right? I had no chance to set a trap card yet, had no chance to develop any monsters onto the board, had no chance to do anything other than interact with my opponent with hand traps, right? And people say all the time, like, oh, Yu-Gi-Oh is only one turn anymore. That's not true. For the majority of mid-range decks, like you will take part in the game on turn two. Like your opponent goes first, and you will have a very real opportunity to play into their board. Like most of the really good Yu-Gi-Oh decks allow for that kind of interaction, right? And those are the games that are more fun because you feel like you took part, like you took part on the second turn at least, and you tried back and forth, break the board. Am I able to? Am I not able to? So on and so forth. And so I feel like it's extra frustrating when you already play against a combo deck that wouldn't allow you to really interact outside of having hand traps, and then you have one of those hand traps and they even have tools to combat that, right? Like it's even less interactive. The one thing that I have as to my disposal on my opponent's first turn even gets stopped by an in-engine Miscellaneosaurus in your example, right? But like even more generically, like a how bad it feels to get your maxi called by the grave by like a combo deck, because now not only am I still gonna sit here and watch you do it, now I also have one less card to even have a chance at breaking whatever you're trying to do, right?
I really, really despise and don't enjoy floodgates, and that's something I'm very known for and outspoken for.
Yep.
In some ways, an all-in crazy combo deck is like a floodgate with like a lot of extra steps, right? Like if your opponent just sets up like a Herald or a Buster Lock, or a searchable Scythe combo, all of
Mhm.
that, like it. I mean, that literally is a floodgate, but like for the most
Yeah.
part, like even just like 5, 6 Omnis or something like that, you really are just dealing with what is essentially
It's the
a
same thing. It's
a
an it's
large
it's
floodgate.
all it's an FTK essentially. It's an
Yeah.
FTK. It's also a floodgate because it technically doesn't let your opponent play. It's not one card that says your opponent can't play, like in the case of a floodgate. It's more nuanced because it's four different monsters together that combined they say, well, we stop four of your opponent's cards, and that probably means they can't do anything. So it's really whatever that whatever it comes down to is it's always just let both players take part in the game. That's simple. Then there's the highest chance of both players having fun.
This was always my main criticism of floodgates was it's arguable to say that fun is a subjective term that can be defined person to person, but
Yeah,
I think like one of the key factors that you've very much developed there was that interactivity is at the heart of it. If
I
you
think
aren't
so too. Yeah.
interacting with your opponent, you're not having fun. If you're not having fun, then that's not really a healthy mechanic generally. So for the same reasons, like if you're not really interacting with your opponent's board because their combo was so crazy, then that's not fun, and that therefore that's by proxy maybe just not good for the game, right? Same with floodgates,
Yeah.
and I think that's really what I think the biggest issue that people have with combo is not only that there's the non-interactivity portion of the part, but also a second portion that I want to maybe try develop a little bit as well. It's just the amount of waiting that exists in Yu-Gi-Oh.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Even if you are playing like a mid-rangey deck, like Tri Brigade, Salmon Great, if you're at a locals and you're playing that
Dragon Link.
physically in person,
Dragon Link is my
yeah,
favorite example for this because I have never classified Dragon Link as an unhealthy deck. Unless if it did something like the Buster Lock or anything like that. But genuinely, every time I'm playing against Dragon Link, or like most of the time when I have like an average or good hand, I'm just sitting there and I'm like, hey, I can just let them play, and that's probably still gonna be a good game. It's not like the um activate Vakaushi and I go top left instantly, right?
yeah,
Um,
even
it,
like historically, there's been so many decks that are fair in boards like
yeah,
Dragon Link, but one of the biggest frustrating factors for a lot of like these stereotypical like Yugi Boomer arguments is like you
yeah,
just coin flip lose, sit there for 20 minutes, your opponent negates everything.
hmm
But the problem is like I think that argument falls apart because some of these decks are very beatable, but it's still very valid to complain about just how long some of these decks take, even
yeah,
non-combo decks. Like I remember playing against Ritual Beast in 2015. I
yep,
weird. I also played that deck. That deck ended on like 2 pops, right? Which I mean at the
yeah.
time was kind of crazy, but like it's still kind of beatable. And what do you do and as a designer, what do you do for the game like that where even like the mid-range decks, do you just stop making decks have combos? Like where do you go from here? Because that I think that is one of the biggest issues of
hmm
Yu-Gi-Oh! And one of the like my draw factors for why I really loved playing a lot of Hearthstone was like it doesn't matter if my opponent is like 100 times more skilled than me. I'm still going to have a couple of turns where I get to do my thing, right?
Yep.
In Yu-Gi-Oh! It's night and day. Like a good player on a good deck will thunder stomp a bad player like over and over again, especially, and on top of that, make them wait for it constantly. On a deck like Dragon Link, for example.
Yeah, I think there's a couple culprits like that. I genuinely feel like most of the time these days it's fine though. Like even if I'm looking at something like past format mid-range decks, like I don't know, you would look at something like Unchained, or like Tearlament when it wasn't full power Ishizu, like Tearlament last format. I feel like the first turns were okay most of the time. Like unironically, it's like Dragon Link is the biggest offender I can think of in the last couple. formats. But other than that, like I guess flu is like that's the main reason I don't like flu that much, even after the barrier statue, which has never it's never really been a power level problem. Like I've never been as opposed to flu because it was too powerful, but it was always more like a I dislike how well shifter's one thing, but I dislike how long that deck takes, and then when they're done with the first turn, they
Do it
do
all
it
again on yours.
again on your turn, uh, and I'm like, "Can I play the game?" Uh, but I don't know. I just think that that's so much less of a problem when it is a mid-range deck and not a full-on combo deck. But I think that's the main reason why a lot of people don't like Dragon Link, even though Dragon Link was never like toxic or anything or unhealthy. It's just that yeah, they should really be careful with how long they even give mid-range decks as like or as far as like the turn one combo goes.
Yep. Good points all around. I think we've covered a lot of that. So I want to
Yeah.
move on to talking about the evolution of combo in Yu-Gi-Oh!
Mhm.
And as far back as the eye can see, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has always been a game that has had uh, some form of a ramping to a particular critical mass and then going all in. We've had reasoning gate all the way back in the day, like even in GOAT format. Like there are
Yeah.
combo decks in GOAT format. There are combo
You
decks.
could argue though that at that point they really were more like the combo decks typical like known from other games as well. Like they would fit into this whole concept way better because they actually were like slow, um, and had to wait to assemble those pieces, and your opponent would try to win the game before you would get there, right? Some games you would get there earlier because you got lucky. Some other games you wouldn't get there as fast, and you would play like specific cards to tutor out those combo pieces. And once you got there, you would pull off the combo and win the game if you got there before your opponent could win, right? Which is not really the case nowadays. There's definitely a difference with how combo decks originally worked and with how they work now.
Yeah, it's weird because old Yu-Gi-Oh combo decks felt very much like, a Hearthstone or Magic combo deck, where it's
Exactly.
like you are trying to assemble these pieces, wait until you've got that critical mass, and then
Yeah,
activate that Trunade or Storm, and then pop off.
exactly. Yeah, like I'm thinking of you mentioned some early reasoning gate thingies. There's been like there's the
Scientist
other one. There was a
FTK,
Diamond Dude Turbo, which I suppose you would classify that as a combo deck, even though it's sometimes even FTK'd.
Frog
There's like
FTK.
Frog FTK was also, I mean, it was technically a combo deck that just was consistent enough to pull it off on the
Yeah, that
first
deck
turn
was
as
kind of
well.
funny, right? Because it was like it's a combo deck, but it can also FTK you. Like that wasn't like the main
Yeah,
game plan. You could set up like a lot of decent plays without FTKing, which I
yeah.
think is really cool about that deck. But maybe not so much for anyone who lived through that, I guess.
It that's the thing, right? It had cool aspects to it, but of course, having an FTK implemented in it was kind of like a a deal breaker to call it a cool deck ever again. But like one of my favorite decks from back in the day, this is this is the segment where I'm gonna make a lot of boomer statements. But I really loved the Fish OTK deck in like 2011,
Shout
which
outs to
is
Calvin Tahan, dude. Holy.
that deck was so sick. I loved it because it was genuinely that, right? It was a deck that was it didn't have any FTK potential because you did try to win with the battle phase, but it was all about, you played that like kind of frog grind game with like, you would try to sit on treeborns and dupe frogs and battle faders and gores and all that for a while until you finally had assembled. You would play Gold Sark to wait a couple turns for your combo pieces. You'd try to assemble like the Trunade or the Heavy Storm, or I believe Cold Wave might have been in there as well. I don't remember exactly which back row removal we had at the time. Like you would have to get 2 tribute fodders onto the board with the help of like Treeborn Enemy. Then you would get rid of the back row, summon I don't even know how you say it, coelacanth, whatever, and go for like whichever you had different OTK lines. You could colossal armory on people. You could just put 8,000 damage on board, depending what monsters they had. It was a really fun deck because you had to genuinely worry about, how do I survive that long? How do I? Sometimes you didn't have the way to remove the back row, so how do I outplay the back row? All that kind of stuff. There was even lines that could outplay Effect Veiler because coelacanth can negate targeting. I'm yapping, by the way. But yeah, that
So
was
these were, yeah, the point is like a lot of these older combo decks, they were not usually like let's go all in turn one immediately,
yeah,
because you did need to, like, you just didn't have that consistency as we do today
yeah.
with modern archetypes. Like you had to wait, you had to build it up. One thing that really stuck with me was the VTuber that I did a reaction to talking about why he quit Mastodon. If anyone remember his name, please post it in the chat. But that video, like that, my reaction to that has like 100K plus views or something, talking about um, like why he quit Mastodon. And something that really stuck with me, Red New, yeah. Shout outs to him. One thing that really stuck with me was that the way that modern Yu-Gi-Oh decks work, it's every game feels the same and kind of is the same, because you have so much instant access to your extra deck back to your main deck, vice versa. So
Hmm.
a good example he brings up is Pearly. Many of those games feel very similar because you're going through that very similar gameplay loop of getting the guy out your deck, you're excavating, you're trying to like end on that same typical combo with those same resources, and then you're interacting with those same kind of hand traps. Old Yu-Gi-Oh decks, non-archetypal based usually, all of those games
Hmm.
feel very different. You play like a 2007 Perfect Circle match or something, I think is what it called, or whatever, right? Like those games feel
Hmm.
different because you're not going to be seeing those same cards turn after turn, game after game, rather. Um, and I
Hmm.
think that's where like the main, shall we say, milestone in Yu-Gi-Oh began. I think is when the games started to feel similar, and I think some of the decks that you've brought up are just before that. And I think like I
I
want to say maybe after Teledad, I think maybe Dragon Ruler is where that sweet spot starts to kick in. I think where the games start to not really. I mean, every game is like Dragon Rulers notoriously have a very fun and good mirror match, but a lot of those duels start to feel samey in the same way that
Mhm.
you're kind of doing the same thing almost every at the start of your turn on almost every duel. You have that same win condition. You're generally cycling through like the same slash similar cards, and then I
Mhm.
think it's progressively gotten more and more faster and to some extent linear
Mhm.
since 2013.
I I get that point. I think that's valid criticism. I think it does. I would like to add to it though that it often, to me at least, I thought about it, and I don't think I feel like most of my games are the same. I don't feel like that, but I do feel like that whole criticism definitely applies to the first turn of the game. Like the first turn of almost any Yu-Gi-Oh game, the deck is trying to do pretty much the same thing. And then where it becomes different is when that thing is being matched up into a different hand by the opponent every time, right? Like you're trying to pull off your strategy, and your opponent's hand is gonna make what is gonna is what makes it feel different from game to game. But I definitely see that, and the reason for that is quite simple. Like decks have just gotten more consistent and faster. So at this point in time, like most of the good decks just have a set combo plan that they try to execute consistently, and because everything, like, in order to be good, has to be consistent, usually tries to make the same thing happen on the first turn. So it's definitely true. Like you'll just have, like, for example, Unchained trying to set up the same board every time. You'll have Pearly trying to set up the same board every time, and so on and so forth, and then it starts being a different game from the last game that you played by, when your opponent starts interacting with you, right?
And I think that's probably where the biggest pitfall for combo happens is like you do have like the same style of end board every game.
Yeah, I mean,
And
this is
then
what the biggest problem comes in. Like, like I said, the game starts feeling different when your opponent starts interacting. But if one deck doesn't allow for interaction, then every game is going to feel the same. Like,
exactly.
genuinely, you can go second without a hand trap 100 times against Super Heavy Samurai. Let's just leave cards like Sphere Mode out of the equation. Like, if you just have to play with Engine into a Super Heavy Samurai going second 100 games, most of them are going to feel the same because you're just going to, like, play a couple cards until you have to scoop it up.
Yeah, and I think that's like one of the major problems and criticisms of combo is that it further exacerbates so many different issues
Mhm.
in the game, and linearity is one of them, or at least
Yeah, no, for sure.
similarity.
That issue that you just mentioned is for sure um, maximized by having a combo deck in the equation.
Yeah. If you were to like create chapters for Yu-Gi-Oh, where would they go? And it's interesting and it's funny because I feel like those chapters have almost always been exclusively been dictated by combo decks because they are the ones that sort of have been setting the pace of the game. You know, you have like year zero to like Teledad, and then maybe another milestone in Dragon
I was
Ruler.
gonna put the first the first marker or whatever you call it, the first split definitely somewhere before Teledad for sure. And everything before that to me is kind of like the where Yu-Gi-Oh was like really slow. Um, which is no bad connotation to any of these terms that I'm using. Like it was just a different game. It was rather slow. It was a very controlly, like almost any deck would end up being a control type of deck because you simply couldn't finish games faster. Which definitely has its appeal, you know, like every once in a while when I'm going back to very old formats, I enjoy that too. But during that time, I would say combo decks exclusively existed in the form of actual what we would consider a classic combo deck as like you're trying to assemble pieces and usually it'll take you a while, you know, whether it's a dimension fusion OTK that you're trying to pull off after like 5 turns in gold format or whichever combo deck you can think of from that era.
Okay, and your next chapter.
Well, definitely starts with like the likes of Teledad and Lightsworn, which I suppose at the time you would call them a combo deck because they had explosive turns. They would just set them up sometimes. No, that's the thing about Teledad. Sometimes it sets that stuff up on turn one, but sometimes it genuinely does it on like turn five. You know, like it's not like you always have your Stratos D draw teleport kind of hands. So it still is compared to later combo decks, rather, I want to say slow in direct comparison, but at the time, obviously, big up in terms of combo level. We definitely have to make a cut before Dragon Ruler, I feel like. That's the next one I was going to say. But maybe even before that.
I would personally, I think like I don't. You would probably know better than I do because I only started playing in Dragon Ruler format or just
Mhm.
after it.
Okay.
But from what I understand, the spike to Dragon Rulers was nothing like you had seen since I don't know Invasion of Chaos, Teledad.
The thing is, I agree with you. The power spike in Dragon Rulers was insane. However, I'm not sure if Dragon Rulers even falls into the category of a full-on like combo deck because
I think for the
genuinely.
people at the time, you could definitely like if you're sitting playing Constellar and your opponent sits down with Dragon
Well,
Rulers,
no,
we know who
like
the combo player there
genuinely,
is.
no, I don't agree with you there. Because this is like we're talking after like windups.
Okay,
Like we've had combo decks, and we at the time we would say like, okay, wind up, that's a combo deck. That
wasn't
was
Wind
a
Up more of an
combo deck,
FTK?
hand loop, and all that. Like we've had things like that before. The reason why Dragon Rulers was so good was not because they were a combo deck that was better than everything else. Dragon Rulers were the king of grind game.
Hmm. It's really
Because a Dragon
interesting.
Ruler first turn, no matter how you put it, that thing's done in 2 minutes.
Yeah, it's really
Like you make a
interesting.
Draco sack, maybe 2 Draco sacks. You draw for your rejuve, you pass.
Yeah, it's
Like if anything, at the time, that deck was like the king of control because it was like unkillable and you could not outgrind it. If you ever make it to turn 2, 3, 4 against Dragon Rulers, like you have no chance.
bizarre as well because
You either floodgate that deck or you OTK that deck real quick.
well, bro just Donowalled me 4 times there, chat. But I think it's strange because I sort of theorized at the start here that the markers of the game were almost exclusively dictated by the spike of the power level in the combo decks,
Yeah, you
and
yapped.
you are adamantly arguing that Dragon Rule is not a combo deck, and I actually, I guess I definitely I see that now that you've
Yeah.
broken it down that way. So it's interesting. Because I think generally you would look at something like that and think, oh, wow, yeah, crazy wall of text on each one of these cards, multiple special summons, expending your hand. All of these are typical hallmarks of a combo deck, especially for the time, and yet,
Yeah, well, the thing is though, like the wall of text on a dragon ruler, because it's one effect per turn out of
that
three.
is true.
That's where the long term value comes in. That's what was crazy. Is like that thing does not only do something right now, it's also going to do something for me next turn and the turn after and the turn after and the turn after.
Yeah. And I think for there, like that power level sort of remains. It kind of dipped
Yeah.
a little and then maybe spiked around about Soul Charge. And I want to say like the next chapter probably just is Master Rule 4. I
No,
think is
pendulum. Yeah. I think you like to complete that previous thingy. I think we put a marker before wind up. Because there is a difference between playing Fish OTK and playing wind up. uh, so in terms of combo decks, like if we just like there's definitely a spike in that sort of concept,
Mhm.
um and then if we talk modern combo decks that try to do it always on the first turn, because not even wind up did it always on the first turn. Wind up was the sort of deck that wasn't consistent enough to be always doing it on turn one, right? And so it had to have, it was loaded with, you played like your standard 10 to 12 trap cards to have a plan for longer games and all that kind of stuff. You would be like wind up,
Was
factory
Infernity around
grinding.
that same time period?
Hmm?
Was Infernity around that same time period?
Infernity comes, well, Infernity released before wind up even. And I guess Infernity is a good point, yeah, because the first wave of Infernity was the way you would think it would be. With triple launcher, it would genuinely be like try to set up 3 barriers and all that kind of stuff. But it also, at the same time, that deck was also very trap heavy, because very often you would take multiple turns. So it's also not quite as first turn heavy as later iterations. But yeah, Infernity had like two major periods. Like it was at release, like 2011. It was really powerful. Um, but it was still at the time a relatively slow, explosive deck, rather. Um,
I mean, Infernity
but
Inferno used to be like a staple, I think, in the deck,
that's
which
the
is
thing, right?
literally
You
a
played
trap
like
card.
3 of the trap card that you had to set and then wait a turn to fill up your graveyard, and then you needed other cards to even make use of the cards you just put into the graveyard. Um, And then there was obviously another Infernity deck around 2014 that also won the World Championships.
Soul Charge Infernity. Go
But
with
I
it.
think all the combo decks that we have mentioned up until this point were all decks that still played a good amount of trap cards, because there was a possibility that you had to grind it out for a couple turns. And I think that changes when we enter 2015, with like the first iteration of like pendulum combo piles, right?
Yeah, we'll get into the details of Pendulum after this,
Yeah.
but from there to Pendulum, I think Mastero, and then from Mastero, do you think Mastero has two different separate categories? Because I think like 2020 we see a spike, but also weirdly
Mm.
2018 was also hugely powerful.
I think there's definitely a spike during Master Rule 4. Yeah, I mean, there's like, we have to talk about like two of the main culprits, I feel like, of two of the earliest, even besides Pendulum, of these modern type vomit your hand onto the board, win the game on the spot, which is, we have to talk about Spiral, and we have to talk about Goki.
Year after year, it's crazy. Since the
Yeah,
inception, 2017, then immediately into 2018,
yeah.
and then 2019 was weird because we just had this like lull period where we had combo decks, the Danger, Jesse Dragon deck.
Danger FTK as well, like 2018. Yeah.
Uh, 2018, man. Like, my God, that
Firewall.
year. Um, and then I would argue like 2020 has that big because that was the release of Link Cross, I think, right? Was 2020 Hulk Link Cross
It was
combo?
all a COVID. Like most of that was during
Yeah.
the early COVID stages.
If ever
So
there was a
yeah.
time to have a pandemic, that was maybe like the best period. Because
Okay,
ima-
okay.
imagine watching events of like Emancipator mirrors, Link Cross mirrors, Eldritch
Yeah.
Synchro mirrors. Like, oh God, that was those are the dark times.
It's definitely, I don't know exactly what the reasoning for it was. I mean, one thing that all these have in common, post 2017, is they all happened after links, and I think that is something that is 100% worth mentioning, is that the link mechanic benefits the combo style decks a lot, simply because links are the most generic extra deck summoning mechanic, and the consistency is a huge factor when you're playing a combo deck, right? Like the having your key combo enablers be cards from the extra deck makes them accessible every single game, as long as you put the right materials up, which are usually generic enough for link monsters. And
Especially
that
when those
makes it,
extra deck monsters are easy to summon. And
That
like you
makes
said,
it
yeah,
that's
link
the only thing
monsters
that
are.
makes it possible for these decks to full commit into combo. To be a fully committed combo deck, you would need a certain level of consistency. Otherwise, you would have to make a backup plan, right? That's the thing that these decks are not forced to do anymore, right? Which is the main difference to decks back in the day, which made them significantly slower and in some ways easier to deal with. Is that these decks nowadays, they don't need to have a plan B. They just have their combo available to them at like 90% plus, or they're not a viable combo deck. And I think the link mechanic plays a huge role in that overall, because I think that's what differentiates like a spiral combo deck from I don't know, an Infernity combo deck, is that you of course you need to draw specific cards, but still, like, it's just you would just put two spiral names out. It doesn't really matter which ones. You don't have to get to specifically Infernity Archfiend and a way to special summon it or things like that. You know, you don't need to get specifically Necromancer Tuner and Archfiend in rotation, that kind of stuff. It's just like, yeah, put two spirals onto the board, you're good to go. You know, put two warriors on the board, and
That's
you
the
have
most
full
egregious
Goki
one.
combo, right?
Two
Those sort of
warriors.
things.
You know, there's only like 3,000 of them in the game.
Yep.
Um, so key point here, I think the greatest real problem of the game, quote unquote, if maybe you even some people might not even perceive it as a problem, but I think it is definitely worth talking about, is there's this link between the main deck to the extra deck and then back to
Hmm.
the main deck that is
Yeah.
far too. I don't want to say too because that implies like a level of bias in how I'm describing this, but there is a level of consistency there that
Yep.
is just like revolutionary to the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Being able to go
I
with those generic penned monsters into an
Yeah.
Electromite, back to
Hmm.
your main deck, or
Yep.
with any two warriors into the main back. Right, so now
Yep.
your deck is just power spiked in consistency,
Yep.
coupled with the fact that link summoning is, and the way I've always described link summoning is, imagine you could synchro summon without the requirement of a tuner, and the level requirement was actually kind of just, plus or minus a couple of levels depending on how you feel, because it's very generous. You synchro summon up to level like what, 10 generally. There's a couple of 12s in the game. Link summoning,
Hmm.
typically you're link summoning in between the 1 to 4 range. So the range of those link summonings is lower, therefore more generic. And on top of that, you don't have a specific monster requirement that synchros do, which is a tuner
Yep.
monster. Not a
Hmm.
lot of link monsters have them, have
Yeah,
those
and they don't
mandatory
need to be
requirements.
the same level either when you compare it to Exceeds. It's just by far the easiest way to put it. It's the by far the most generic extra deck
Yeah.
summoning mechanic, the easiest to get there usually. And I remember you also bringing up this the some an argument that I liked, which I remembered because that's special for you to do that. Is you you said it was a problem whenever extra deck monsters access something from the main deck, right?
Hmm.
And I think that is a very good point. And one other thing that I also dislike about Link monsters is, or one concept that I don't like about Link monsters is the fact that a lot of them give you an extra body, which is a
Yeah.
concept that I despise in Link summons because I think it invalidates the entire design of link summoning. Whereas, like, you put a value on these cards by printing them at a certain link level, right? A link 1 is supposed to be easier to summon than a link 2. A link 2 is easier to summon than a link 3. A link 3 is easier to summon than a link 4. And then all of a
You mean
sudden, if
harder,
you
right?
make a huh?
You mean harder.
Link 2 is easier than link 3. Link 3 is easier than link 4.
Yeah, you meant harder. Link 2 is harder summon than Link 1. Link 3 is harder than 2, right?
No, in the order I said it, it was link 1 is easier than 2. 2 is easier than 3.
Okay, that's definitely not what you said, but I see what you're saying. Sure.
Okay, that's
Run
what I
it back,
wanted to
chat. Run it
say
back.
anyway.
All right.
So
Anyway,
the thing is,
continue. Continue.
if you design a link 3 based on, okay, you know, if you have any sense for balancing, you're going to balance it around the fact that it requires 3 monsters, right?
Yeah.
And now you print a link 2 that summons a body. So all of a sudden, I can summon this link 3 that was supposed to take 3 monsters by using 2 monsters. And then if I make a link 3 that summons a body, I can make a link 4 with that link 3 that I made with just a link 2. So all of a sudden, this link 4 monster that was designed to take 4 monsters takes 2 monsters. And I think that entire thing is a huge problem when it comes to just the link mechanic, which happens to also be a case in a lot of combo decks abusing that sort of thing. You think of Cyberse, the archetype in general, which should
I was
just be
gonna try
deleted.
and bring that up, but there you go.
Yep.
Yeah, Cyberse is one of the worst defenders of this
Exactly.
link
It's
climbing.
it's the worst. It's the worst. Like you can throw hand traps at them all you want as long as they end up with a freaking breadcrumb on the board, they're gonna access code attack you
My
for
link with a
10,000%.
breadcrumb.
And it's not just Cybers though. It's also that was the main problem with stuff like Halka Fibrax, Aurora Dawn. It's just that it's link monsters that summon more stuff instead of just doing what extra deck cards, in my opinion, should do, which is just like be toolboxes and give you different forms of maybe interaction with your opponent rather than interaction with your own main deck. Uh,
Yeah. So I think a key component there we've identified is definitely one of the sort of overriding factors of combo.
yep.
And I did want to like talk about the. Well, I suppose we can bring this next thing I wanted to talk about up in the types of interruptions. But let's move
Mhm.
on. We're gonna talk about just a little bit about pendulum as an entire not real archetype, but as a mechanic. Pendulum has sort of embodied the major problems of combo, quote unquote. So much so to the point that Master 04 was changed so that some people might not even know this right now if you're really new to the game. But the way Master 04 used to work is that extra deck monsters could only be summoned to the extra monster zone or to the zone a link monster points to. So synchros and fusions and Xyz used to like literally just work the same way that link monsters do. And then at some point in 2020, they revised this and they made it so that synchros, fusions, Xyz, and synchros, fusions, and Xyz could be summoned to any zone.
Yep.
However, they did not reverse it for Pendulum.
Yep.
They didn't change it.
Which is also worth noting is that in Master Rule 3, before that entire extra monster zone even existed, pendulum monsters would just all be summoned from the extra deck into the main monster zone. So you could just 0 cards in hand, pen 5 from the extra deck.
Every single
Which,
turn. Every single turn.
but the thing about pendulum is that it's just I personally just think pendulum as a mechanic is flawed. Um, I think it goes as far it goes so far that they need to be so careful when designing a pendulum strategy just to make it interesting that I think at this point they should just I don't know I guess they should just acknowledge the fact that pendulum was not very well thought out. I feel like because the whole mechanic is flawed from deck building to actual gameplay because pendulum monsters because you have to assemble a high and a low scale, you are very much incentivized to put as many pendulum monsters into your deck as possible from the get-go. It was always like you needed to draw as many as possible because you needed to set up scales and then and still have stuff left that was worth pendulum summoning. Plus, it gives you the ability to just pendulum summon everything you want from your hand. So why wouldn't you just put all monsters into your deck that can be pendulum summoned and do something when pendulum summoned, and therefore your game plan and deck building plan is always vomit your entire hand onto the board. Because why wouldn't you? Why would I set up 2 pendulum scales to pendulum summon 1 monster out of my hand if I can just summon everything?
When Pendulum was first conceived of and revealed to the public, people thought that, oh wow, so I can set up these 2 scales and then just pendulum summon out a Blue Eyes White Dragon. I don't need like the tribute
Mhm.
fodder, you know?
Yep.
And people thought like, okay, well, that's kind of good, right? And then
Yep.
slowly but surely realizing that that's just a
In
heavy
in
minus.
reality in reality, it was a huge, like, you would damage your deck's consistency in a huge way if you put, too many cards in there that weren't pendulum monsters.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, even something like people would play, like, Apex Avion for the first time in that period to pendulum summon an Omni Negate, right? That would return to your hand and could be pendulum summoned again, right? And that
Mm.
was solid. It was, like, one of the few exceptions of cards that people actually did play, but that was, like, the only one in those type of decks, and even that was risky because you didn't wanna draw too many of it. Like, you need to make sure you draw a high and a low scale, otherwise nothing works, right? And so, most of the pendulum decks historically have just been all pendulum, and that's to this day, pendulum, the deck, is just a slob of like a bunch of different pendulum engines that efficiently set up scales, do something when pendulum summoned, and you just usually, I don't know, you end with 0 cards in hand most of the time.
Yeah, I think pendulum is probably one of the only mechanics in the game that has never really had like anything outside of a combo deck. Really, I want to say the closest thing was Cliffort, which in some cases didn't usually act like a typical pendulum deck.
But that's the thing. That's the thing. Those are the kind of things that they need to be doing if they want Pendulum to be somewhat interesting. At least to, I mean, I'm sure there's
Oh,
people
we
that
need
find
more
current
Cliffort.
Pendulum interesting, but like there are a couple times where they try to make Pendulum decks that, and I think that's interesting to make the Pendulum mechanic revolve around the Pendulum scales, but it's like different. Like I'm thinking like Nemleria or these things, right? That or Valmonica, right? The kind of the recent attempts at making interesting pendulum strategies that don't just end up being this sort of deck that we've talked about. The problem is that these are just failing one after another because it's simply it seems to be very hard to balance a deck around this mechanic because you have to make sure it's not too powerful because otherwise they're just going to throw it into another combo pile. Um, and you still want to keep it interesting, so you have to give it some very random restrictions to make sure it doesn't end up being that combo deck, which has just so far resulted in not very many like actual viable decks.
Yeah, I think like the direction of Nimleria, for example, I don't know if they're gonna keep reiterating and making decks like that where Pendulum is be trying to be used as a thing that you don't actually even do pendulum summons with. It's just a
Yeah,
card that just has bonus effects to it based on where
yeah,
you put it.
yeah.
Uh, so that is kind of like the approach they've seemed to have been taking recently. But
Yeah.
yeah, like you mentioned, every time they design a pendulum card, it's very much at risk of just bolstering the deck into yet another vomit your hand wombo combo pile.
Yeah.
And I think that they've taken some steps recently to address that by making something like Volmonica and Nimleria. And very
Mhm.
recently as well, we've seen from Phantom Nightmare, we're getting the new Magispector Link monster, which
Yeah.
is an extremely powerful card that just literally just searches two guys.
Yeah.
But they're putting some very heavy restrictions on it. They are literally
And they
telling, what is it?
they absolutely have to, like, they're forced
Yeah.
to because the mechanic is rather I think it's flawed, but even though it does have the room, like, even with a flawed mechanic, you can design some pretty cool cards because, it opens a lot of design spaces with how it's designed. Like, I remember one of my favorite Pendulum cards at the time was Archfiend Eccentric because simply the fact that it was this kinda utility tool that you could either summon it to be a monster removal or you could scale it to be a spell trap removal. That sort of stuff opens a lot of design spaces for you as a game like designer, card designer for Yu-Gi-Oh! And I wish they would take more advantage of that, right? Like make cards that are just they are pendulum cards, but they don't care about the pendulum summoning aspect. They care about the aspect of hey, this card can be used as a spell or as a monster, right? Which gives it a huge like flexibility boost, right? And they haven't really been playing around with that enough to my liking because the only card I can think of right now that plays with that and is like playable outside of pendulum decks would be like Archfiend Eccentric. I can't think of them ever having made many other cards that have been viable and have played around with that fact.
Yeah, that's a very good example. I love the utility that thing offers.
Yeah.
Being able to use Archfiend Eccentric, I think it was like Necro's format. You could like play
Oh
it as
yeah,
like
yeah,
a Jin out or like as an out to
yeah.
like skill drain, which was
No,
really
I
neat.
love that design of the card because it also got around another problem, which we're probably going to talk about in a different episode. But like the fact that in certain times, you know, it wasn't feasible to main deck dedicated spell and trap removal, even though some people would main deck cards like Skill Drain or whatever. But you couldn't just main deck like you wouldn't want to main deck like MST always when everyone else was playing Necros. But a card like Archfiend Eccentric was good enough to be played because it didn't only have that one purpose.
Let's move on to the type of interruptions that combo decks have set up and the
Tier
different
list,
boards.
tier list time.
The different boards that they make, which I think is where the heart and soul of the frustrating factor can come from players.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about Dragon Link and how that has always been one of the fairer combo decks.
Mhm.
To right. Other than I suppose early versions where you had like Buster Lock and LP, like that was maybe a little too much. But
Mhm.
I think like usually the type of combo decks that end on just a bunch of like disruption is usually quite fun or enjoyable to like play through for the most part. But I think the
Mhm.
biggest egregious problems that not pendulum that combo can, well, pendulum definitely part of it to an extent, was
Mhm.
the fact that you either put up multiple omni negates or,
Yep.
most powerful of all, a generic searchable floodgate.
Yep. So yeah, I think it comes down to there's like Omni Negate is the one that is the most famous because people always talk about, five negate boards, 10 negate boards, 20 negate boards. Uh you which I think my personal opinion on Omni Negates is that they aren't as bad as people make them out to be. I just think they are bad when they are paired up with too many other things. Also paired up with too many other Omni Negates. Like I think there's nothing wrong, or I guess not that much that's wrong with just like ending on a Baron de Fleur with maybe some other side stuff that isn't super oppressive, right? Whereas like Omni Negates become infinitely more problematic when they are paired with, for example, a floodgate, right? Which at that point makes it, then it becomes toxic, which in this case is the problem the Baron that's protecting the anti spell, or is the problem the anti spell, right? Or is the problem the Scythe lock that is being protected by the Baron, even if you have an out? Those kind of questions, right? I would say um, I've never felt frustrated because my opponent has ended on one Baron. It's usually what is next to it. Um, but obviously, there's also combo decks that have just put up way too many Omni Negates because there's only so much you can do. You can outplay one Omni Negate with a full hand of cards. You can like use your less valuable cards first to force the Baron and all that kind of stuff. So it encourages good gameplay to figure out how do I get my opponent to use this Baron de Fleur so I can pop off after. Of course, that kind of falls away when your opponent doesn't have enough to think about it because they have five anyways.
Yeah, I don't know if we decided to actually define tier limit as a combo deck or if it's like a really powerful mid range deck. But for the
I
sake,
would I would have classified it as a very powerful mid range deck, like
yeah,
similar to Dragon Rulers, kind of like back in the day felt, how unbeatable in the long term, but even incredibly powerful early on.
well, for the sake of argument, if we do look at it as a combo deck, I think one of the
Hmm.
cool and interesting parts of Tier Lament was that it had a whole bunch of different styles of disruption that you end on.
Yeah,
Even
yeah,
current Tier Lament, for example, you're ending on like at an absolute stretch, like one Omni Negate if you can get to
yeah,
like a Destro for your Baron. But you
yeah.
also have like a Destruction effect with your Field Spell, a Spin effect with your Kaleido Heart,
Hmm.
a Monster Negate with your Sulik, and maybe Book of Moon if you play something like Meta Noise, right? These are all
Yep.
varied types of disruption, which I
Hmm.
think are, I think for at least the player playing, it does require you to think a little bit in how you use that disruption.
Hmm.
Depending on the deck, if they're playing Zodiac, you just book the normal summon, then maybe you just auto win, for example,
Yeah.
right? But in a lot of cases, I think like um, being able to like see your opponent have like different types of disruption, I think is like generally quite fun to play into with the right, one or two non-engine pieces. And I
Yeah.
think like those are the type of disruptions that combo decks put up that I think are mostly okay, right?
Hmm. I think it is worth mentioning though that even the quote unquote I would agree that everything that isn't necessarily, like, I think there's three problematic ones, which are too many omni negates, floodgates, and hand loops. Those are, in my opinion, the most problematic ones.
Mm.
And then there's a whole bunch of other ones, like you mentioned, like Book of Moon, soft just effect negation, like Soliak or something like that, or bounces back to the hand like a seals or whatever, like maybe a banish or whatever, a pop. Those kind of things. Those are typically okay, but even those in critical mass can feel like you didn't have a chance to begin with, even though you can try playing into and hope your opponent like messes up massively. But like uh, you know, even though I agree with you, all the tier limit interactions individually were pretty much fine. Like a full tier limit combo against a non tier limit deck was still friggin' like hydrogen bomb coughing baby. Like you knew you could try to play into it, right? You wouldn't be floodgated out of putting your cards onto the table, but you knew it was pointless regardless.
I think there's a lot of problems with the things that we talked about earlier, which is like the ease of access for the extra deck, where
Mm-hmm.
build-a-board combo decks can access things like Dagda for Scythe, the
Mm-hmm.
Baron, the Appaloosa, and those type of interruptions that it ends on coming so generically from the extra deck, I think has
Yep.
been generally one of the major problem points of combo decks, right? You look at Super Heavy Samurai and Master Duo, and I don't know what Super Heavy Samurai cards are even the problem for the deck in the end board, right? Like none of
I mean,
them.
they don't end on a super heavy samurai
Exactly.
typically.
So it's like
There's like there's one that pops Scythe. That they make that sometimes.
sure. So I guess that begs the question, like, do we think that's the problem? Is like, do we think like cards like Baron, Appaloosa are the real issues with the game, or do we think it's like Hulk, Isolde? You know, it's like, is it the cards that extend, or is it the cards that you end
Mhm.
on that are like being such a problematic tool for combo decks?
It's a tough question, and I could see arguing either way. But I generally think in order to also combat the problem of turns just being very long, even for mid range decks, I would just love to see less cards that always access everything from your deck, especially in the form of special summoning. I don't have as much of an issue going into a synchro or a link or an exceed that searches a card, which it's funny because most of the rank fours or link twos or link threes or synchro eights that search you a card have historically not been that much of a problem. Like I'm looking at Infernal Queen Banshee, the one that searches Pyro Monsters, or Gear Gigant X, or anything like that. Those never felt like they would enable something super crazy. Like, yeah, they sometimes have a really good search target, and that makes them still worth playing, but it doesn't feel like those have ever come close to the power level of an Isold or a Halka Fibrax, or the ones that just immediately special summon the thing, right? Or Dagda setting it to the board immediately. I feel like if they want tutors from the main deck to exist, which I feel like at this point we can't really go back from that, like decks just need to be consistent. I would prefer for them to not immediately special summon the thing,
Interesting. Special
at least.
summoning. Yeah, okay. I think it's like kind of like for the for a lot of decks, right? Like, is there really a difference between summoning a monster from the deck and adding a monster from a deck? Depending on the card, there might not be a difference, right? Sometimes. But yeah, generally, like
Mhm.
floating is usually like the major pain point, right? Like a body that floats back from the grave or out of the deck after you
As
link
well.
summon. It's like
Yeah.
that whole
Dude,
concept of
just
just
delete Cybers. I'll sacrifice my beloved Salamangreats, and we just delete the Cybers type. I've been saying that.
it's not really much of an indicative form of competitive meta theory, but just for context, in the last card standing, we just banned Cybers, like the type, like
Oh, that sounds
it,
based.
like it came to a point where every single Cybers archetype in the game was banned. We banned every archetype, but it was still topping because it just had like there's just so many Cybers cards that just say summon or float or uh,
Yeah.
so that's usually quite a problem with the mechanic itself. Um, yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the counters here.
Mhm.
It's sort of like in the current state of the game. I mean, what do we consider counters to combo decks, or rather, what do we think are healthy combo decks counters to combo decks design
Okay,
wise?
so one major counter is you just roll a higher number than they do.
Huge.
Which is I want to preface this by saying I'm not a huge fan of combo decks. In not in the sense of like not actually like that I don't like them as a concept, but rather I also tend to not find them very good from a competitive aspect. Simply because those type of strategies are typically flawed when it comes to you need to go first, you need to go second, you need to hope that your opponent doesn't have the right answers, right hand traps, right board breakers. I find to me it feels very gambly, um, which means that even though they are sometimes very relevant in the format, I typically never find them to be that powerful in terms of the actual win rate. And that circles around to the type of stuff that you just need to do to counter a combo deck. I feel like it's just either you go first in game one and you're gonna have a good time anyways, which is not always true, but usually, and then the other thing is like even if you go second game one and you don't have any tools in your main deck, all you need to do is win game two going first, and then have the heavy board breakers in the side deck, right?
I think the major turning point that we see from at least like an insight into Konami's mindset is they've recognized that that combo is here to stay. It doesn't look like they'll be designing away from it, and it doesn't look like
Mhm.
they'll be
Yep.
trying to address it. They will probably still keep making crazy wombo combo decks.
Yep.
But what was interesting was, I think, a major milestone was the 2019 Megatins
Oh
that
yeah.
introduced Dark Ruler, Shifter, and
Oh yeah.
Nibiru.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
three of those cards were specifically designed to stop wombo combo, right?
I have my own tinfoil theory about that, which I don't
Okay.
know if I don't think it's that hot of a take, but
All
I
right.
think a
Show
lot
us the
of the
cook.
combo decks that have existed in the past were designed by the OCG, where we get the majority of our cards from. And they are still playing a game with 3 Maxi. And I think their design philosophy is we're designing these combo decks with the idea in mind that they can never really get that out of hand because Maxi is always going to put a damper on their win rate, right? Which I still don't agree with because I still think like that doesn't really introduce a very fun gameplay. Even if the deck has a 50% win rate, which doesn't make it competitive, still doesn't make it fun. Still doesn't mean it should be there. But I guess that's what they're thinking. You know, they're like, oh, Maxi's in the game. It's not going to be that crazy. And then when they come over to the TCG, we don't have Maxi anymore because Konami TCG is based in that regard, and like they end up being a problem. And so I think at some point the TCG just said, "Hey, no, we need to design our own answers to these crazy combo decks that the OCG people keep throwing at us." And that's why they released these in the TCG first: the Dark Rulers, Shifter, and Nibiru.
Like the win rate has always been such a poor argument for me because,
It
you know,
is. It is.
Royal Magical Library Exodia FTK, Treasure Panda Exodia FTK, Blaze Phoenix, whatever. Like all of these decks have like horrible win rates, but like
Yeah.
they're not fun to play against, right? So
No,
it's
it's fun
like,
for one player. Like
yeah.
you.
So it's like realistically, like the problem here is like the win rate is not defining
No.
the validity of the, well, not really the validity of the deck, but the just the interactivity of the deck and how fun that is for the player
Yeah.
base.
No. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, but yeah, going back to those tin cards, in just as a as a thought here, in hindsight, because it's been almost 5 years now, crazy. 2019 was 17 years ago. That's wild. When I first read Nibiru and Dark Ruler, I thought that Dark Ruler at least would be a 100% mandatory staple card in every single deck, at least the side. And I
Mhm.
genuinely thought that's how broken that card is. And it's crazy that a card like Dark Ruler, as powerful as that is when you read that, has still
Yeah.
not been as relevant as I think a lot of players thought it was going to be. Because these combo decks have evolved
It's
and adapted with the game and have
yeah.
developed ways to play around it. You can chain a spell card and then chain a hot red to negate the Dark Ruler. You can.
Yeah, no, that's where the tinfoil goes back on, because for a while it felt like Nibiru and Dark Ruler were really effective at like you just drew that one card against the combo pile and you would be good. Uh, but the OCG eventually got those cards as well, and like we've established, for some reason the OCG wants combo decks to exist, right? And so now they were in a situation where it was not only Maxi that was hurting combo decks, it was also Nib and Dark Ruler, and so they just made better combo decks. Right now, all the good combo decks nowadays they make a Baron before summon 5.
Exactly.
They have searchable counter traps to negate the Dark Ruler or the Forbidden Droplet, and they just do him like that now, right? And they just make him like that, and so it feels like if
Yeah.
they keep making these sort of necessary evil band aid fixes, whatever you want to call them, uh, it's just going to be a cycle, right? They give us new tools because eventually, Nibiru is not going to cut it anymore. Because you draw Nibiru against Manadium, sorry, not good enough. You draw Nibiru against Super Heavy Samurai, not good enough. That card was designed to beat these type of decks, but it doesn't anymore. So
So
we need Nibiru
strange.
too.
um, Yeah, I think we touched upon a lot of the counters there. I don't know like what we see as like the necessary evil, right? Like Maxi really is like the
Droll.
necessary evil that they have in
Droll
OCG.
Droll is my biggest example of a necessary evil. There's a lot of cards that people classify as such that I don't really deem necessary, like Maxi. Like Maxi is way more of an evil than necessary, is the way I like to put it. Because the card is simply too powerful overall. Droll is also a powerful card, but it still feels like I'm putting Droll into my deck and I'm at the risk of drawing it, in matchups where it's not good, in like situations where I don't want it, and all that kind of stuff. Maxi is way too generically powerful. Droll and Lockbird is a card that I'm not a fan of Joel and Lockbird, is not what I'm trying to say, but I think it does fulfill this thing of like, whenever Joel and Lockbird is a main deck staple, I think it says more about the format than it says about Joel and Lockbird.
Yeah, I think that's like a
And
very popular sentiment is
and
the
whenever it is popular, I'm also happy that it exists, right? Like in Master Duel right now, yes, the sign that Droll and Lockbird is at 70% usage is not a good sign for Master Duel, but that doesn't mean it'd be better if Droll didn't exist. It just means it'd be better if Super Heavy Samurai didn't exist, right? I view it that way around.
Yeah, exactly. So this is like the entire essence of the matter here. It's the idea that yeah, we can design cards that are quote unquote like healthy to deal with these cards. Like Nibiru Shifter and Dark Ruler were the
Mhm.
main sort of like milestone go second cards. We had Evenly Matched in 2017 as well, for example, though you could argue that hurts
Droplet was also huge.
back row decks, for example.
Mhm.
Droplet, yeah, big card as well that was designed to counter these things. But the
Yeah.
problem is like I feel like you can only design so many good, powerful cards in this way, right? I think the
Yep.
major issue is that I don't think cards are the solution to fixing combo, right? I think it's a design aspect, right? Unless because in the end, like if you it doesn't matter how many cards you design, right? Because in the end, you still need to draw them, right? Like
It
we've seen
still
so
it,
many
it
different
does
iterations.
if there's enough cards that are viable and invalidate combo strategies, it would solve the problem because they would simply not they would lose their competitive viability. Because the thing is, like, crazy Yu-Gi-Oh first turn combos have existed since freaking, I don't know, 2011 or something. You would find crazy Gishki FTK hand loops on YouTube all over the place, or I sold summon 4 or whatever, right? The difference between those and modern combo decks has never, like, they've not been less toxic or anything like that. They've just been less viable because they weren't equipped to deal with for example, a single effect veiler at the time, right?
Well, this is
And
where I'm
that's the
gonna
difference.
disagree with you. I think
Mhm.
because I think that the combo decks have just adapted. Is the issue, right? Like,
No, that's
uh,
what that, no, that we don't disagree on that. Like,
okay, but I think that's the problem, right? So it's like if they keep designing these cards, but combo is just going to
yeah.
keep adapting, right?
No, yeah, that's why I said that there's a cycle to it. Like, if they for some reason want to sell combo decks, make new combo decks and sell them, they have to make them outplay the current hand traps.
So what is the
That's true.
solution? Do they stop making them? Do we
They
just
either have
keep?
to stop their idea of, we need to have viable combo decks, uh, or it's going to be that cycle.
Yeah, because then we are just in this perpetual arms race between combo and
I
anti-combo cards and
I
trap
will
cards,
say
and
I will say I think this is particularly an issue that is more so existent in the OCG in recent years. I feel like, and the one thing I'm thinking of, the reason I say this is because of how fast they got rid of Super Heavy Samurai in the TCG, which
was
was
it two
something
weeks? I
that,
think it was.
yeah, I personally didn't expect it, but I feel like most people were pleasantly surprised by that. And it to me it clearly showed that sentiment of, like, that deck was around in the OCG forever because for some reason they want it to exist, but the TCG department didn't seem to agree with that.
Do we
And
think
so
that
that
like
makes me hopeful.
there's
That makes
just
me a little hopeful that these, like, because Super Heavy Samurai was really the worst example of a combo pile recently, right? And so that made me hopeful for at least the TCG in the future, right? Like,
do we think there's like a divide here between their design philosophies? There seems to be like very different
there
visions
has
for
to
the
be,
game.
because like, literally it comes down to one singular card, and that is Max C.
Mm.
There has to be a difference in philosophy when that card is legal in the OCG at 3, and the TCG has banned it, what, 6 years ago?
Yeah.
7?
So a polarized situation like that is very very strange, I think. One
Yeah.
thing that's interesting to note is the TCG tryout duel event that happened in Macedo, where you could play with the
Yeah.
TCG list, which is no maxi. There's been a lot of piqued interest from the East at this whole discussion again.
Is there
Um,
data for this?
well, I was actually going to take a look at through for anyone who's interested. There is a big Reddit thread with a huge compilation of a bunch of translated from Chinese opinions and takes on that event in Macedon that took place, and it really is just like different. It's a discussion that you would expect. There's a lot of people saying like, "Wow, this is a crazy breath of fresh air. This is interesting," but there's also a lot of countering opinions on that from the
Yep.
OCG saying like, "Well, how can they not play without Max E? That's I have no chance if my opponent is playing X deck and I don't have Max E, etc., etc." So
Mhm.
there's a whole bunch of discussions going around right now talking about this,
Yep.
sparked by the Master Duel event that utilized the TCG regulation.
Mhm. It's just sad because I feel like this one card difference is responsible for so many of these issues. Because the same is true in the other direction, because they often have decks in the OCG that are specifically good because they don't care about Maxi. Um, and they designed them that way, right? They designed them specifically to not give the opponent that many draws, but that just makes them fundamentally flawed for us because they don't have that advantage over here. Um, it's just a whole another question of, should OCG and TCG be so separate? Because obviously having different philosophies in your ban list, but then designing the same cards for both games
Is
can
very
lead to
weird.
problems,
Yeah,
right?
I
You're
think
designing cards for two different formats. It's obviously you can't always satisfy both.
get a bunch of like really differing games sometimes, right? Like you look at, for example, um, like Dragoon Turbo was huge in OCG, right? Like literally
Yeah,
just invoked or just any sort of like Verte Dragoon deck was so powerful because ending on this crazy boss monster in two summons was,
exactly. Yeah,
phenomenal into Maxi, right?
yeah,
But in TCG that was never a thing. Like we'd
yeah,
never play Dragoon Turbo was like in TCG was like you do your full combo and then you have a Dragoon as well.
yeah.
Right? Like that's how it played out in TCG.
Yeah, you. I think people underestimate the importance in terms of your overall win rate, in terms of your chance of success at a tournament. Like in the OCG and in Master Duel as well, it's a genuine strategy to play a deck that has a good plan against Maxi, rather than relying on drawing your Ash or something for it. Um, that makes up for your deck being maybe less powerful than other decks overall. Like you have a deck with a lower ceiling, but you don't lose 10% of your games to max E, which evens out your overall win rate. You lose some games because your deck's not as powerful, but you lose less games to max E. And so it's this entire balancing factor that they are designing archetypes for that is missing when decks come over to the OCG. So sometimes we have combo decks that remain with too little checks, and then we have mid-range decks that are not powerful enough because they lose that sort of extra win percentage with maxi.
Well, I think we've covered some of the major milestones and topics here. Is there anything you
Yeah.
wanted to expand upon a little bit more before we wrap this episode up here?
I want to say, even though we've talked about it now for almost 2 hours, I think for the majority of the last couple years, it's I genuinely find Yu-Gi-Oh enjoyable most of the time. Is what I'm trying to say, because I find like the most decks that are actually at the top throughout the history of the game even have not been combo decks. It's only, I feel like, a couple outliers that have actually made it into the top tier. Because at the end of the day, it's like it's not just that your combo deck has to be incredibly good at going first and making an incredible combo board happen. It also needs to be able to play through hand traps, play going second, be good after side decking, be good into board breakers and all that kind of stuff to be competitively viable. And that majority of the time, the combo decks just don't check all of those boxes, right? And so I'm typically not that worried about them, and they've historically only ever really been that strong um, a couple of times, like a handful of decks that you would actually argue were the best deck in their respective formats. Um, but I still think it's an issue that because they exist and because they make games unfun sometimes, they just do they just don't do the game any good or like many good things. Like it's just it. I think it draws away more players than it adds when these pop up every once in a while.
I will say as a personal comment here, I have always adored combo decks, specifically graveyard piles have always just been my
Mhm.
favorite decks to play in the game. I don't know
They
what it
are fun to
is.
play, almost all of them. Like even Goki and Spiral and all that, they were like, if you were the one doing the comboing, they were fun.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but just, interacting with snow, milling a lot of cards with grass. Like historically, we've seen
Mhm.
so many different, uh, types of graveyard decks, and they've always been combo decks, and those are the ones I've really enjoyed the most. When it's a very strange paradox for people like me because I do recognize like it's definitely not good for the health of the game long term
Yep.
for something like a grass pile or adamantipator or something like that to be viable and to be meta and to be
Mhm.
good.
Yep.
But at the same time, they're just so goddamn fun. It's like I don't know.
I think it's the same as with everything. I think there is some merit to them existing because there are people out there that enjoy them, and I think it's completely okay for people to enjoy it. And therefore, every once in a while, I'm okay with a combo deck popping up as long as I have some tools to combat it, to not auto lose every time they go first, for example, right? And I think that's what it comes down to. I think that's what we also have to settle for in the long run, because I don't think they are going to get rid of them completely. So please give me the tools to beat it at least, and then I suppose I'm going to be able to live with it, right? And make sure that they're not always the best deck. Maybe one format we have a good combo deck, and then the next format we don't. So that I don't have to worry about it every single tournament that I enter, right? And I think that already be good enough for my end.
I think as much as I enjoy playing so many combo decks and the glass cannon nature of it, I think for me personally, and I don't know how other like combo players feel, but I think like conceding to the fact that it just has more problems than it solves, or has
Mhm.
more negatives than positives. The positives being is that it's extremely goddamn fun,
Yeah.
but I'm very like hard pressed to find positive arguments for combo decks outside of just fun. Which you
Yeah.
could argue, I mean, that should be
I mean,
enough.
fun is it would be the main argument, but like
Yeah,
fun for both players would be a
yeah,
better
but you
argument.
could look. But the thing is, like, when you look at like, is Tri Brigade the best deck healthy for the game, right? You can come up with, I think, a lot of like objective
Yeah, no, like
positives for
most
that.
of the mid-range decks I think is what most people would agree on are the
Yeah,
bread and butter of what Yu-Gi-Oh should be. No
exactly.
matter
And
if it happens in 2 turns or back in the day in 10 turns,
mhm.
the fact that they go back and forth, leave your opponent some room to play with you even if you went first, that is I think where the most beautiful Yu-Gi-Oh is being played.
Exactly. And um, there is just a lot of objective positive arguments, like all the ones you mentioned, for decks like that to be the best deck. But with combo
Mhm.
decks, I do really struggle to find positive arguments for it in the attempt of an objective sense to
Mhm.
define positive arguments for combo decks being
Yeah.
viable and the best decks in Yu-Gi-Oh.
Yeah, the only one that I find is that they're not for me, but I acknowledge the fact that some other people really like them. And I guess that makes it somewhat good enough of an argument for me.
Mhm.
Like I'm not putting myself in the position of like everything that I don't like should not be in the game, right? Because I acknowledge that some other people might enjoy Yu-Gi-Oh in different ways, and therefore I'm okay with combo decks existing. Um, not all the time, but like sometimes, I guess is the way I like.
Well, that concludes another episode of the Heart of the Cast. Thank you guys for tuning in to another week and another episode. Of course, we're still very early on in the cycle and life of this project, so we're
No
still
Apple.
we are we're working on it. We're working on it. We're still trying to get as much of your feedback on board as possible. So do leave us comments and ideas and topics, questions you want us to explore. We're this is aiming to be some sort of a weekly segment, and there's always going to be some type of downtime in the game. We don't always have an event every single week to talk about, so there will always be room and time for interesting subjects. And I think with your guys' help and attendance on both of our live streams and social medias, which you'll find in the description, etc., do support us both and tune in and give us your feedback. So thanks for tuning in and watching or listening this week.
Bye bye.